18 years ago, a young woman stepped out of a crowded bar in Lexington and was never seen alive again. Her name was Hannah Walker, a 19-year-old college student whose future seemed bright and certain. That October night of 2007 became the beginning of an enduring nightmare. The last person seen with her was Jake Howell, a 27-year-old maintenance worker who was known to many in the community. He claimed he dropped her off safely, but no car, no body, and no solid proof ever surfaced. Suspicions swirled around him for years, yet evidence remained too thin for any charges. Hannah's mother, Susan Walker, refused to surrender to despair. Through grief and loneliness, she carried the weight of unanswered questions, believing the truth had to be out there somewhere. And then, after more than a decade of silence, the waters of the Kentucky River revealed something hidden all along. The discovery did not just confirm what many feared, it reshaped the story completely and unsettled the community in ways no one could have predicted. What really happened to Hannah Walker on the night of October 12, 2007? And why did it take 16 long years for the most crucial evidence to finally surface? Could the shadow of another man have been present that night? A man whose identity still lingers in secrecy? If you want to uncover the answers to these haunting questions, then like this video and subscribe to Unscripted Tales. Also tell us from which city you are watching this cold case story, and let us complete 5,000 likes so more people can follow this mystery until the very end. On that autumn evening in Lexington, neon lights glowed from a bar that served as a popular gathering spot for students and locals. Inside, music blared and laughter echoed. Yet outside, in the damp parking lot, the last known moments of Hannah's life unfolded. Her disappearance was not just the loss of a daughter or a student, it was the beginning of a story that would span nearly 2 decades. At first, many believed it would be solved within days. But as time stretched on, the case became layered with rumors, false hopes, and chilling discoveries that left the community questioning their own sense of safety. Hannah's mother never gave up her search, and her persistence became the reason the truth would one day resurface. This is the story of Hannah Walker, of the man who stood by her family while hiding secrets, and of a river that held its silence for 16 years before finally speaking. The night was alive in downtown Lexington. The small bar glowed with neon signs, its walls trembling under the sound of guitars and heavy drums. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, the floor sticky with spilled drinks, and laughter rose above the music as students celebrated the end of another long week. Among them was 19-year-old Hannah Walker, a young woman with brown hair tied high, whose presence brought light to the table of friends she sat with. She was bright, smiling, half distracted by the music, half lost in her own thoughts. A drink resting unfinished in front of her. As the evening pushed deeper, Hannah stood and slipped away from the chatter. Outside, the bar's door creaked open to reveal a damp parking lot washed in yellow glow from the flickering streetlights. Rain earlier in the day had left thin puddles, their surfaces shimmering like broken glass. The security camera above the bar's entrance caught her as she stepped out. The footage, later replayed countless times by police and the media, showed her pausing, arms folded tightly across her chest, facing a man familiar to nearly everyone in town. It was Jake Howell, 27 years old, working odd jobs as a maintenance worker, known in the community for showing up where people gathered. The video offered no sound, only blurred shadows and gestures. Hannah looked tense, her head turning away as Jake leaned closer, his hands moving quickly while he spoke. A friend who later recalled the scene said Hannah looked uneasy, almost as if she was being pressed into a corner of conversation. Eyes darted, her stance was stiff, and her lips moved with words no one would ever hear. At precisely 11:48 p.m., a message lit up on her friend's phone. Hannah wrote a short line that would become her final trace. "Jake is taking me home." The message was simple, but chilling in hindsight. Within moments, her phone lost all signal. Calls went unanswered. From that instant forward, Hannah's voice was silenced. The parking lot was not empty that night. A taxi driver waiting nearby later spoke of what he saw. He remembered a silver-green Toyota Corolla pulling out quickly, headlights cutting through the wet pavement. Behind it came another vehicle, older and heavier, a faded red pickup truck. Its lights flickered, almost flashing as if signaling, and it followed close, too close for comfort. The driver remembered how the hum of engines faded into the night air while the music still echoed from the bar. That detail, overlooked at first, would grow darker with time. The sequence was small, almost ordinary to those passing by. A girl leaving a bar, a man at her side, a car pulling away. Yet it was in these moments that Hannah's life took the turn that would break a family and haunt a city for years. The camera's grainy view ended with her stepping into darkness, and no one in Lexington could have guessed how much weight that final recording would carry in the years to come. Every pause that night mattered. Every glance, every step on the damp pavement, every beam of headlights slicing through the fog. To Hannah's friends, she was simply heading home. To her mother waiting for a morning call, she was only out late. To the community, she was another student enjoying her youth. Yet for investigators, those short minutes became the fragile chain of evidence. A timeline stretched to its breaking point. The parking lot footage, the final text, and the silent witness of the taxi driver together formed the last pieces of Hannah's known life. From that instant, the mystery began. The silver Corolla that disappeared into the wet Kentucky night carried more than a young woman. It carried a story that would remain hidden beneath shadows and silence for nearly 2 decades. The next morning, when the phone rang unanswered, the first threads of dread began to tighten. And within hours, the city of Lexington would wake to a mother's cry. And a case that would never again let the community rest easily. The night faded into morning across Lexington. Fog rising low above the streets, as if the city itself wished to hide. At the Walker home, Susan dialed her daughter's number the way she did every weekend. It rang, but there was no answer. She smiled at first, thinking Hannah was simply resting after a long night out. Hours slipped by, and the calls remained unanswered. By noon, the smile had vanished. When Hannah's best friend admitted she had not heard from her either, a chill moved through Susan's chest. Something was terribly wrong. With trembling hands, she called the Fayette County Police. Her voice cracked as she said her daughter never stayed out overnight without letting her know. Officers were dispatched within the hour, arriving at the modest family home. They took statements and listened to Susan's words, her eyes swollen with worry. Every second felt like an eternity. Soon, 2 patrol cars rolled toward the bar where Hannah was last seen. In daylight, the parking lot no longer hid beneath music and neon glow. It was a bleak stretch of cracked asphalt, littered with beer cans, stained with old oil. The scene of laughter only hours before, yet something about it felt off. Officers noticed smudges and scattered items near the camera's reach. A beer can marked with faint lipstick rested close to the curb. A broken leather bracelet lay half buried near a puddle, as if torn from a wrist in a sudden struggle. Tire marks curved sharply toward the exit. Streaks that suggested someone had pressed the gas hard in haste. Each piece was carefully photographed, bagged, and sealed. To anyone else, they were scraps of a messy night. To investigators, they whispered that Hannah's departure was not free and willing. The officer in charge muttered under his breath that the scene did not feel right, and his words settled heavily in the morning air. By the afternoon, Jake Howell was brought in for questioning. He entered the station in a wrinkled shirt, his face calm, his manner flat, as if he was prepared for the questions. When asked about the night before, he said Hannah had asked him to drop her off at a gas station near the highway so she could catch a ride to her dorm. He said he left her there and went home. His arms folded, his tone even, his eyes unblinking. The officers pressed him. Did anyone see the drop-off? Could they check the gas station's cameras? Jake hesitated, then admitted the cameras had been broken for weeks. His explanation left a gap too wide to ignore. Without corroboration, his words hung like smoke, thin but impossible to grasp. He repeated again and again that he had done nothing wrong, that he was only trying to help. Outside the interrogation room, Hannah's friends gathered at the station. To give their statements, their voices wavered with fear as they spoke of Jake's persistence, how Hannah had complained about his presence, how she sometimes called him the unwanted shadow. Their accounts added weight to suspicion, but not enough for proof. That evening, as Susan sat at home staring at her silent phone, the first headlines began to roll across local news. University student vanishes in Lexington. The city's calm was fractured, and the puzzle of Hannah Walker's disappearance had begun to spread far beyond her family's walls. The beer can with lipstick, the broken bracelet, and the tire marks formed the first clues of a mystery that was only starting to unfold. And with Jake's thin story already fraying under pressure, investigators faced a question that would not let them sleep. Did Hannah leave willingly, or was she forced into the night by someone she feared? As investigators worked through the first day of Hannah's disappearance, they turned to those who knew her best. Friends arrived at the station, faces pale from shock and sleepless nights. One by one, they spoke of the man who had been seen with her in the parking lot. To them, Jake Howell was not a trusted companion. He was the man who lingered at parties uninvited. The man who showed up at places Hannah went, as if by coincidence, though she whispered that it felt deliberate. Sarah Miller, Hannah's roommate and closest confidant, could hardly keep her tears steady. She told officers that Hannah often described Jake as a nuisance, someone who would not leave her alone. She admitted Hannah never wanted to escalate matters, never wanted to involve the police, but she was unsettled by his constant presence. Another friend, Mark, remembered that night at the bar with sharp clarity. He said Hannah's body language was reluctant, her eyes uneasy, as if she was only agreeing to something she did not want. His words added tension to the already fragile chain of events. The accounts painted a troubling picture, yet none of it was enough to place Jake under arrest. Without a witness to the supposed gas station drop-off, without clear footage, suspicion remained locked in a cloud. The bracelet, the beer can, and the tire marks were evidence of struggle, but not proof of a crime. For Susan Walker, this gap between truth and evidence was agony. By evening, local news outlets seized upon the story. Headlines cut across television screens with bold letters: University of Kentucky student vanishes. Viewers saw Hannah's smiling photo beside the word missing. The coverage spread fast, and the mystery reached into living rooms across the city. Susan agreed to speak on camera. Sitting in her modest home, clutching a framed picture of Hannah, she spoke through a trembling voice. She said her daughter never disappeared without a word. She pleaded that if anyone knew something, they had to come forward. The sight of a grieving mother pleading for answers touched hearts across Kentucky. For the first time, Lexington felt the weight of the disappearance, not as a distant report, but as a wound within its own community. Hannah was not just another student, she was a daughter, a friend, and her absence left a gap that no words could fill. As the media replayed Susan's plea, speculation began to spread. Viewers asked questions. Who was the man last seen with her? Why had the gas station cameras failed? What happened between the parking lot and the road that vanished into the night? Each question dug deeper, fueling public attention and setting the stage for a case that would only grow more complex with time. The image of Hannah's bright smile stared from television screens and newspapers, but behind those images, the story had already begun to twist into something darker. And soon, the city of Lexington itself would join the search. Determined to bring answers to a mystery that was already deepening. The disappearance of Hannah Walker quickly moved beyond a single family's grief and into the heart of an entire city. Within days, downtown Lexington transformed into a command post for hope and desperation. Flyers with Hannah's photo appeared on shop windows, gas station doors, and telephone poles. Volunteers arrived by the hundreds, some friends, some complete strangers who felt compelled to join. They gathered with flashlights, boots, and maps, ready to search every corner of the city. Police widened their efforts. Search dogs were brought in, their noses pressed to the ground, as handlers led them through fields and wooded paths. Helicopters hovered above, beams of light cutting through the night sky. The Kentucky River became a central focus. Boats drifted slowly across the murky surface while divers slipped beneath the cold water, searching for any sign of Hannah or her silver-green Corolla. The air along the river was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the bark of a dog or the sudden shout of a volunteer who thought they had seen something. Again and again, the hope crumbled into disappointment. What surfaced was never Hannah, only logs, old tires, or fragments of forgotten debris. Each failed attempt tightened the knot of fear in the community. Yet the effort never stopped. Groups spread out into fields, combed through abandoned barns, and inspected back roads that led away from the bar. Every tip, every rumor, became a reason to search again. But as the official investigation stretched on, so too did the whispering of rumors. Some pointed fingers at Hannah's ex-boyfriend, a young man with a quick temper who had been seen arguing with her on campus months earlier. Others cast suspicion on an older professor, someone in her department who had developed a reputation for being overly familiar with female students. His name was never spoken openly, but stories spread that he had sent messages to Hannah outside of class. Even the taxi driver who had noticed the two cars leaving the bar came under quiet suspicion. People murmured about his past, about complaints from passengers who said he sometimes made them uncomfortable. Each story took root, whether true or not, and grew in cafes, church pews, and campus hallways. For Susan Walker, these rumors were torture. Each one suggested a different fate for her daughter. Each one painted a new shadow, and none brought her closer to the truth. For the police, the flood of stories drained time and resources, yet they could not ignore any possibility. Every name had to be checked, every rumor tested, even if it led to another dead end. Lexington felt the weight of uncertainty. People locked their doors earlier, looked twice at their neighbors, and wondered if someone close to them was hiding a secret. The search had united the city in effort, but the growing tide of rumors was beginning to divide it with suspicion. And in the middle of this storm, Hannah's face stared from every flyer and television screen, reminding everyone that the truth was still missing. What the community did not know was that the next clue would come not from a rumor or a search team, but from the hidden pages of Hannah's own thoughts. By early December, weeks had slipped away with no sign of Hannah Walker. The searches along the Kentucky River had ended in futility, and the tide of rumors had left everyone exhausted. Susan Walker's home was quiet most days, the silence broken only by the ringing of the phone when another false lead arrived. It was during this heavy season of despair that an unexpected clue surfaced from a place no one expected: Sarah Miller. Hannah's roommate and closest friend had been asked by police to carefully go through Hannah's dorm room. She was sorting through books, clothing, and scattered papers when her hand brushed against something thin wedged beneath the mattress. She pulled out a small diary, its cover worn from use, the pages lined with Hannah's familiar handwriting. Sarah froze, her heart racing. Then quickly called investigators to the scene. When officers opened the diary, what they found chilled them. Most pages were filled with ordinary notes, class schedules, assignment reminders, coffee dates with friends. But hidden between the routine were entries that revealed a darker side of Hannah's final weeks. "Someone is always following me," she had written. "Each time I leave class or walk out of the cafe, I feel eyes on my back. I want to believe it is in my head, but it happens too often." On another page, her words trembled even more. "Last night, I saw a shadow outside my dorm window. When I turned on the light, he was gone. All I saw was a tall figure with dark hair." Hannah never gave a name. She never pointed to a clear identity. But the words suggested what many had begun to fear: she had been stalked. Asterisk for Susan, reading her daughter's private fears was unbearable. She clutched the pages, her tears staining the ink, whispering to herself that if Hannah had only told her, she could have helped. But now, those words were all she had, and they cut deeper than silence. When the existence of the diary was announced, the media seized upon it immediately. Headlines blared with chilling titles. Was Hannah being hunted by a shadow? Television programs invited experts to discuss the psychology of stalking, while talk shows speculated endlessly about who the mysterious figure might have been. Diary became the central piece of public conversation, and the phrase "the shadow" echoed through the community. Some believed the entries pointed directly to Jake Howell, the man already suspected by Hannah's friends. Others insisted it could have been her jealous ex-boyfriend, or even the professor whose behavior had already raised questions. For others, the diary confirmed their fear that someone entirely unknown had been circling Hannah's life, waiting for the night she vanished. In Lexington, fear and suspicion deepened. Parents warned their daughters to walk in groups. Students checked over their shoulders at night. The presence of a shadow, unnamed and unseen, unsettled everyone. For investigators, the diary was both a breakthrough and a dead end. It confirmed that Hannah had felt pursued, but it gave no proof of who had followed her. It widened the field of suspicion, but offered no closure. Still, it changed the way the case was seen. This was not only a missing persons mystery. It was a story of a young woman haunted by someone she could not escape. The discovery of Hannah's diary darkened the case in a way no rumor could. Her own words revealed fear, and those fears would forever shape the search for truth. But soon, another voice would step forward, claiming to have seen something the night Hannah disappeared, and their story would reopen a path investigators thought had closed. The winter of 2008 settled hard across Lexington. The cold winds cutting through streets that still carried Hannah's face on fading posters. Snow piled against curbs, and yet the Walker family's grief felt heavier than the weather. By now, searches had slowed, and the diary's words about a shadow stalker haunted the city. Still, police pressed forward, combing through tips that trickled in day after day. Most led nowhere. But one tip arrived that seemed to breathe life into the case. If only for a moment, a retired truck driver named Harold Jennings walked into the police station on a grey morning. He was in his 50s, his voice rough, his eyes shadowed by guilt. He told investigators that on the night Hannah vanished, he had been driving home on the road near the bar. He remembered seeing a silver-green Toyota Corolla, the same kind shown in the news, and right behind it was an old red pickup truck. The memory had weighed on him for months. At first, he thought it was nothing, just two cars heading in the same direction. But when the story of Hannah's disappearance spread, and the image of her Corolla filled every television, he could not shake the feeling. He had held it in for too long. Now, he said, he had to speak. The detail shook investigators. A red pickup had been mentioned once before by the taxi driver outside the bar, but with no proof it had faded into rumor. Harold's account seemed to confirm it. Two witnesses, both strangers, both describing the same shadow vehicle. The police jumped on the lead, convinced the truck might belong to the person who had taken Hannah. That night, teams scoured records for every red pickup in the county. Officers knocked on doors, questioned owners, inspected vehicles that matched the description. They combed junkyards, checked abandoned cars, and followed up on repair shop logs. Each time, hope rose that they had found the missing link, only to collapse when evidence came up empty. Either the trucks did not match, or their owners had alibis that checked out. The red pickup seemed to vanish into thin air. Meanwhile, one man stood at the center of the search effort, always visible, always willing to help. Jake Howell. He showed up at volunteer drives, pushed boats into the river, trudged through frozen fields, even stood shoulder to shoulder with Susan Walker at prayer vigils. Cameras captured him looking solemn, holding candles, offering words of comfort. To the public eye, he was the loyal friend, the man who cared deeply about Hannah's fate. Reporters filmed him speaking with a steady voice. He said he was heartbroken, that he wanted answers, just like everyone else. Some believed him. His presence softened suspicion in the eyes of neighbors who thought no guilty man would work so tirelessly for a missing girl. But not everyone was convinced. Inside the investigation, a young officer named Laura Bennett began to feel uneasy. She had studied Jake closely, watched how he always seemed to be in front of cameras, how he stepped into every search as if he needed to be seen. She wrote in her notes that his involvement felt too perfect, too present. An innocent man did not need to prove his innocence at every turn. Her instincts whispered that Jake was hiding something beneath the mask of a grieving friend. Still, without proof, her concerns carried little weight. Senior officers reminded her that Jake had cooperated, that he had no record of violence, and that chasing him without evidence would waste time. The focus remained on the red truck, even as every lead ended in disappointment. Susan Walker, watching from the sidelines, saw Jake stand beside her again and again, holding her hand, offering comfort. To others it looked like kindness. To her, it felt hollow, almost mocking. Each time his hand touched her shoulder, she felt a chill that only deepened her suspicion. Yet, like the police, she had no evidence, only an ache in her chest that told her something about Jake was wrong. By the end of that winter, the case felt frozen, stalled in the snow, like the city itself. The red pickup had become a ghost, leading police in circles with no destination. Jake's image as a helpful volunteer grew stronger. While beneath the surface, a few still wondered if his eagerness was nothing more than a careful disguise, and as the year turned, with Hannah still missing and no answers in sight, the city of Lexington began to accept a painful truth. This was not a case that would be solved quickly, and in the quiet of those cold nights, the shadow of Hannah's diary and the ghost of the red pickup merged into one haunting question that no one could silence. Was the man who took Hannah hiding in plain sight all along? As the new year of 2009 began, the hope that once fueled the community of Lexington was already beginning to flicker. The endless searches, the whispers about the red pickup, and the discovery of Hannah's diary had kept people engaged for months. But with each passing day, the trail grew colder. Volunteers who once filled the fields and riverbanks began returning to their normal lives. The posters that once hung fresh and bright in store windows faded under rain and sunlight, curling at the edges until they were quietly removed. The Fayette County Police continued their efforts, but every operation ended the same way. Divers returned again to the Kentucky River, plunging into its dark depths, but surfaced with nothing more than twisted metal or river debris. Helicopters swept across farmland and woods, scanning for signs of tire tracks or abandoned vehicles, but they found only silence. Detectives revisited names that had been whispered early in the case, from the jealous ex-boyfriend to the professor whose behavior raised questions. Each time the interviews ended with no evidence strong enough to move forward. For Susan Walker, these repeated failures were unbearable. She woke each morning with the same question. Where is Hannah? Her husband, David, tried to stay strong, but even his steady frame began to crumble under the weight of grief. Susan grew more convinced that Jake Howell was hiding the truth. She remembered the way he hovered at vigils, the way his hand rested too firmly on her shoulder, the way his eyes seemed cold even when his voice was soft. Her instincts screamed that he was involved, but the police dismissed her fears, reminding her that there was still no direct evidence that by late 2009, the story of Hannah Walker was no longer headline news. Other tragedies filled the airwaves, and her case began to slip from the public's daily conversation. Candlelight vigils that once filled church pews were now smaller gatherings. A handful of loyal friends and family continued to light candles, their voices rising in prayer, while Jake Howell sat among them, whispering words of hope. To outsiders, his presence seemed loyal, but to Susan, it felt like mockery. In early 2010, after years of fruitless searching, the police made an official announcement. The Walker case was being designated as a cold case. Files were boxed, stamped, and shelved, waiting for evidence that might never come. For Susan, hearing those words was like losing her daughter all over again. It meant the urgency was gone. It meant her family was expected to wait in silence until someone stumbled across a miracle. But Susan refused to let go. She kept Hannah's room exactly as it had been the night she vanished. The bed made with pale blue sheets, the desk covered with books and photos, even the alarm clock, its hands frozen at 12:47, the time police believed Hannah disappeared. Each morning, Susan opened the door to let the sunlight in, refusing to let the room turn into a tomb. In public, people spoke less of Hannah, but in Susan's heart, the suspicion only deepened. Each time Jake walked into a vigil with downcast eyes and comforting words, she clenched her fists. She knew he was not innocent. She could not prove it, but she felt it with every fiber of her being. By the close of 2010, the city of Lexington had begun to move forward, but Susan remained trapped in the night of October 12, 2007. For her, the case was never cold. It was burning in silence, waiting for the truth to be unearthed. And while the official files gathered dust, Jake Howell still stood among neighbors as a man of compassion, hiding a secret that Susan could almost touch but never hold. What no one yet realized was that the years ahead would bring new revelations from the river that had hidden Hannah's fate for far too long. When the case was stamped cold in 2010, Lexington slowly turned its face away from the mystery. But inside the Walker home, time had stopped. Hannah's room remained exactly as it had been the night she left. The pale blue sheets still stretched across her bed. The desk still held her notebooks and framed photos of high school dancers. On the nightstand sat a small pink alarm clock, its hands frozen forever at 12:47. Police had marked that time as the moment she was last seen leaving the bar, and for Susan Walker, it became a permanent scar. She refused to replace the battery. The clock, stopped in silence, was her way of keeping the moment alive. As if admitting time could move forward meant giving up on her daughter. Every morning, Susan opened the door to let the light spill across the room. She refused to let the air grow stale or the walls feel like a tomb. But each time she crossed the threshold, her heart split open again. Hannah's sneakers by the corner, a sweater folded on the chair, the little notes she had left scattered across the corkboard. Each detail was a reminder that her daughter was gone, and that she still had no answer to the question that haunted her every breath. David Walker tried to stay strong. He went to work, paid bills, and stood by his wife's side at vigils. But even the strongest frame begins to bend under the weight of grief. Every time he passed Hannah's shoes by the front door, his jaw clenched. Every time the phone rang, and it was not news, his fists tightened until his knuckles whitened. Slowly, his health began to falter. Chest pains came first, dismissed as stress, then exhaustion, then nights of sleeplessness spent staring at the ceiling. He told Susan more than once, "What is the point of healing if we never know where she is? I would only be a living shell." In 2013, the shell broke. A heart attack claimed David's life in the small living room of their house. At the funeral, Susan sat motionless, her eyes hollow, her body drained of strength. She knew her husband had died carrying a wound that could never heal. He went into the ground, still asking the same question she asked every day. Where is Hannah? David's death pulled Susan further into isolation. Bills began to pile up. She left her part-time job at the grocery store, her body too frail and her mind too consumed by the ache of loss. The reward money that had once been Hannah's college fund was gone, swallowed by years of false tips and searches. She sold her old car to cover medical debts left behind by David. Neighbors who had once visited with words of comfort grew distant, unsure of what to say after so many years. Her home grew quiet. Some nights she sat on the porch in a wooden chair, staring down the empty street, waiting for something, anything, to change. One memory returned to her, again and again. In 2009, long before the case was declared cold, she had stepped outside, late one evening to take out the trash. Across the street, beneath the dim yellow streetlight, a figure stood staring up at Hannah's window. It was Jake Howell. He did not speak, did not wave. He only stared at the light in the room where Susan always kept a lamp burning for her daughter. When she called his name, he flinched and walked away. The next day, she reported it to police, but they dismissed her. No crime had been committed. Maybe he was just passing by, they said. But the image never left her. His shadow against the lamplight, his silence, the way he vanished into the night. To Susan, it was not harmless, it was a taunt. A reminder that he knew more than anyone believed. By 2015, the community had moved on. Hannah's story was no longer whispered in cafes or discussed at Sunday services. Only Susan carried the torch, placing Hannah's photo at the front pew of the church every week, lighting a candle, whispering her daughter's name. And through it all, Jake Howell still stood at her side, at vigils, still whispered words of comfort, still wore the mask of a loyal friend. For Susan, grief had become a prison. She had lost her daughter to the shadows, and her husband to heartbreak. And yet, even in the silence of her small home, one truth burned inside her. She could not stop, she would not stop. She was certain Jake Howell carried the answer, and she would wait as long as it took for the mask to crack. What Susan could not know was that outside her walls, new groups were beginning to rise. Civilian search teams with sonar and determination were preparing to take on the river once again, and their work would soon uncover what had been hidden for more than a decade. By 2016, nearly a decade had passed since Hannah Walker vanished, and for most of Lexington, her story had grown distant. But for Susan Walker, the years had only sharpened her resolve. She refused to let Hannah's memory be buried beneath the silence of time. That year, something new stirred hope. Civilian dive teams from across the country, inspired by cold cases that had been solved through persistence and advanced technology, began arriving at the Kentucky River. One of the first groups was Sunshine State Sonar from Florida. They brought high-tech sonar scanners and small boats. Determined to search waters where official searches had long since ended, Susan stood on the riverbank as they launched, her frail hands clutched together, her body trembling with anticipation. The divers cut across the murky surface, their equipment pinging against the depths. Every shadow on the sonar screen made Susan's heart stop. But again and again the divers resurfaced with the same answer. Nothing connected to Hannah. Old junk cars, rusted appliances, and logs long buried in silt. Still, Susan's determination caught the attention of another team, Blue River Recovery from Tennessee. Their leader, a man named Mark, promised her they would return as many times as it took. He reminded her that sonar technology was advancing, and one day the river would give up its secrets. For Susan, it was enough to keep hope alive. In 2017, another clue emerged. A hunter from Jessamine County stepped forward after 10 years of silence. He claimed that in the fall of 2007, just weeks after Hannah disappeared, he had seen what looked like part of a car hood sticking out of the water near an old bridge. At the time, he thought it was an abandoned wreck and ignored it. But when he heard of the civilian teams, guilt drove him to speak. His words set off a flurry of searches. Blue River Recovery returned to the exact spot with sonar, but after days of scanning and diving, they found nothing. The car might have been swept away by the current, or perhaps the hunter's memory had blurred with time. Susan's hope, once again, was raised high, only to fall crushingly low. Despite the setbacks, Susan refused to let Hannah's name vanish from public thought. She began appearing on television programs, first locally, then nationally. In 2018, she sat beneath the harsh lights of a program called America's Missing Voices. Hannah's photo filled the backdrop, her smiling face staring out at millions of viewers. Susan's voice was weak but firm, as she said that she did not know where her daughter was. But she would never let her be forgotten. The broadcast moved viewers across the country. Some sent letters of support, others donated to the search fund. For Susan, each word of kindness felt like another reminder that her fight was not in vain. In 2019, she appeared again on another true crime program, this time reading from Hannah's diary. She read the words that had haunted her for over a decade. "Someone is always following me." The studio fell silent as her trembling voice carried those words across the nation. The audience sat frozen, and millions watching at home felt the chill. Journalists reignited their coverage, asking why such an alarming case had been left unsolved for so long. For a brief time, Hannah's story was alive again in the national spotlight. Then, in 2020, the world shifted. The pandemic silenced everything. Civilian dive teams were forced to halt their work. Susan sat alone in her house, unable to attend vigils or meet searchers, left with only Hannah's room for company. She passed the months, sitting at the desk where Hannah's photos still rested, writing letters to cold case organizations and non-profit groups, begging them to take up her daughter's case. Some responded with promises, but few followed through. The silence of lockdown deepened her loneliness. But still, she clung to faith that the truth would be found. By 2021. When restrictions eased, Blue River Recovery returned. This time, they brought newer sonar equipment capable of deeper and clearer scans of the riverbed. Once more, Susan stood on the shore as their screens lit up with faint outlines of sunken metal. Each shape brought a surge of hope. But once again, nothing matched Hannah's car. Only more rusted relics of accidents long forgotten. Susan whispered into the cold air as she watched. "Hannah, I am here, give me a sign." But the water offered none. In October 2022, the 15th anniversary of Hannah's disappearance arrived. A memorial was held at the local church, candles glowing in the autumn darkness. Susan's face was thin and lined with grief, but she carried Hannah's photograph to the altar, as she had done every year. The congregation prayed, their voices rising together, but the crowd was smaller than it had once been. People had grown weary of a case without answers. One presence, however, never faded. Jake Howell. He still came to every memorial, still lit candles, still offered his hand to Susan with the mask of a grieving friend. Cameras caught him bowing his head, his expression heavy with sorrow. To many, it looked like devotion. But to Susan, every glance of his eyes filled her with unease. She believed he knew more than he had ever admitted, and his presence only deepened her torment. By the end of 2022, Hannah's case remained unsolved. The dive teams had found nothing, the hunter's memory had led nowhere, and television appearances had kept the story alive but brought no closure. Yet, in the shadows of disappointment, the pieces were aligning for something that would soon shake the city of Lexington. For while the river had resisted for years, it could not keep its secrets. Buried forever. The winter of 2023 was bitter along the banks of the Kentucky River. Ice clung to the edges of the current, and fog rolled low across the surface. After 16 years of disappointment, few believed anything new would come. But on a frigid morning, in February, Blue River Recovery returned once again, their boat cutting through the grey water. Susan Walker stood on the shore, wrapped in a heavy coat, her body frail but her resolve unbroken. She whispered the same prayer she had spoken countless times before. Let this be the day. The team launched their newest sonar equipment, capable of reading through the layers of mud that had hidden secrets for decades. On the screen, vague shapes emerged. Metal shadows half buried in the silt. The operator leaned closer, his finger pointing. There are several objects down there. Old wrecks, most likely. But then he paused, zooming in on one particular outline. The dimensions were clear. A compact sedan. The size matched perfectly to Hannah's Toyota Corolla. The boat fell silent. Susan's knees trembled as she gripped the railing. She could barely breathe as the divers suited up. Each buckle of their gear echoed like a drumbeat. The team leader raised his hand. 3, 2, 1. Then the splash as they plunged into the icy water beneath the surface. Their helmet cameras showed only darkness and swirling mud. Every movement stirred clouds of silt that wrapped them in shadows. Flashlights cut through only a few feet at a time. Then, at last, one diver reached out and touched metal. The clank of his glove against the surface carried through the cums. It is a car. The words jolted the team on the boat. The shape of the vehicle emerged as they cleared away layers of silt. A curved hood, a trunk half buried, wheels hidden in the muck. The diver brushed along the back and froze. The license plate was covered in mud, but with careful effort he scraped it clean. Through the grainy camera feed, the letters and numbers became visible. KY 497C7. It was Hannah's car. The exact plate from the night she disappeared. On the shore, Susan collapsed into tears, her shoulders shaking as she whispered her daughter's name. 16 years of endless questions had led to this moment. The river had finally given her something back. The divers continued their inspection. They reported a windshield shattered outward, glass fragments jutting away from the frame. This was no ordinary accident. It suggested Hannah had been alive inside the car, fighting to break free as the water rose. The thought sent a wave of horror across the team. Above the surface, Susan clutched her scarf and nearly fainted. The image of her daughter pounding against the glass in her last moments cut her deeper than words could describe. The divers then spotted something wedged between the front and back seats, a plastic bag, sealed tight despite the years. Carefully, they pulled it free and brought it to the surface. Inside were strands of hair, matted and dark. When examined, the texture was clear, thick, coarse, and male, not Hannah's. The air grew colder as the implications sank in. If male hair was in her car, then she had not been alone. Either someone had been with her that night, or someone had left it behind deliberately. The mystery grew darker as the divers cleared more silt from the vehicle. They found a blue canvas book bag in the back seat. The strap was rotted, but intact. When lifted from the water, Susan's hands covered her mouth. She recognized it instantly. Hannah's book bag. Inside were soaked notebooks and a faded University of Kentucky student ID. Hannah's smiling photo looked back at them through cracked plastic. There was no doubt left. This was her car. These were her belongings. On the floor near the driver's seat, they discovered a single sneaker, a woman's shoe that matched Hannah's size. Only one. Its presence raised questions. Why was it off her foot? Where was the other shoe? Did she lose it while fighting in those final moments? When the car was hauled slowly from the depths, mud streamed off its sides in heavy sheets. The rusted frame groaned as it broke the surface, water gushing from broken windows. On the shore, cameras captured the moment, reporters narrating as the car rose from its watery grave. Susan wept, trembling as she watched, whispering, "Hannah, I found you." But her words were mixed with anguish. Forensics quickly cordoned off the site. The car reeked of mold and decay as they set up tarps for examination. Every inch was photographed and bagged. Glass shards, seat fabric, the sneaker, the book bag, the hair-filled plastic bag. Each piece became part of a new chapter in the investigation. The revelation shook Lexington. News spread across the state and the nation. Missing student's car. Found after 16 years, headlines blared. Televisions replayed the sight of the Corolla dripping mud. The student ID held in gloved hands. People flooded social media with outrage. How had this car been missed for so long when the river had been searched again and again? Could Hannah have been saved if it had been found sooner? Susan returned home that evening carrying her daughter's student ID, given to her by investigators for safekeeping. She placed it on a small shrine in her living room beside a framed photo. She touched the cracked plastic and whispered, "I found you, Hannah. But justice for you is still far away." The Kentucky River had finally given back Hannah's car, but with it came even darker questions. A shattered windshield, a lone shoe, and hair that did not belong to her. These were not answers. They were shadows stretching longer over the city of Lexington. And for the first time in 16 years, the world realized that this disappearance was never a mystery of chance. It was a crime, carefully buried, waiting for the day it would surface. What investigators would soon uncover in the evidence taken from that car would turn suspicion into fire and drag Hannah's case back into the center of national attention. Very next morning, after Hannah's mud-covered Corolla was lifted from the Kentucky River, Lexington awoke to front pages screaming the news. Car of missing student found after 16 years. Photographs of the battered vehicle dripping with water-dominated television screens. Anchors repeated one question with sharp voices. How could this car sit in the river all this time when the police claimed it had been searched dozens of times? Across the city, people gathered in cafes and barbershops, whispering in disbelief. At schools, teachers found their students buzzing about Hannah's photo on the front page. Even those who had not thought of her case in years were jolted awake by the discovery. For Susan Walker, the attention was overwhelming. She had begged for years to keep her daughter's name alive, and now it was everywhere again. But the weight of the nation's eyes was almost too heavy to bear. That evening, Susan stood at the church where she had attended countless vigils. The sanctuary was packed with neighbors, reporters, and strangers who came to pray. Candles flickered against the walls as the pastor spoke of the wound Lexington had carried for 16 years. Susan sat in the front pew, Hannah's recovered student ID in her hands. She did not speak, but her silence was more powerful than any sermon. Meanwhile, investigators tried to calm the rising anger. In a press conference outside the courthouse, officials admitted that earlier searches may have missed the car because of shifting currents and heavy layers of mud, but the explanation did little to quiet the fury. People shouted that negligence had stolen any chance Hannah may have had for survival. Others whispered of cover-ups. How could something so obvious be overlooked again and again? As public frustration grew, another leak added fuel to the fire. A local paper reported that the hair strands found in the plastic bag inside Hannah's car did not belong to her. Forensic labs had confirmed the hair was male. The headline ran in bold across the page. Was another man in the car the night Hannah vanished? The revelation spread like wildfire. Television hosts debated whether Hannah had been trapped with someone else or whether she had been driven into the river by more than one attacker. National outlets seized on the story, calling it one of the most chilling cold case revelations in years. People who had never heard of Hannah before now spoke her name in living rooms across the country. For Susan, the leak was devastating. She had always suspected Jake Howell, but now the thought that another man had been present tightened the fear that her daughter's final night had been even darker than she imagined. In a trembling interview, she said that her daughter was not only betrayed by one shadow, but possibly by more than one. Her voice broke as she begged authorities to uncover the full truth. Pressure mounted on Fayette County officials. Veteran officers from 2007 were asked to explain themselves. Some claimed that the car could have been buried under new silt. Over the years, others admitted that sonar technology had been less advanced at the time, but their words rang hollow against the outrage of a city that had waited 16 years for answers. In the days that followed, Lexington was consumed by suspicion. Neighbors looked at one another differently. People who had once stood beside Jake Howell at vigils now wondered if they had prayed with a killer. Some said the hair proved there was more than one man involved. Others believed Jake had orchestrated everything himself. The uncertainty festered like a wound, reopening old fears. Officials had no choice but to act. With cameras rolling, they announced that Hannah Walker's case would be fully reopened under a dedicated cold case unit. They promised every piece of evidence would be re-examined with modern forensic tools. They assured the public that this time nothing would be ignored, but promises were not enough to silence the growing storm. For the people of Lexington, the image of Hannah's Corolla pulled from the river, paired with the discovery of hair that was not her own, changed everything. It was no longer only about one missing student. It was about how much had been missed, how much had been hidden, and how much danger still lingered in the shadows. And as Susan sat quietly at her kitchen table that night, Hannah's student ID resting beneath the glow of a small lamp, she whispered that she had finally found her daughter's car. But the real battle was only beginning. The investigation that followed would not only return to the name of Jake Howell, but also point toward someone else whose identity had remained hidden for years. The discovery of Hannah Walker's car and the shocking revelation about the male hair sent a wave of outrage across Kentucky. Under mounting pressure, Fayette County officials announced a bold step. A new cold case unit would be formed, staffed with seasoned investigators, and equipped with modern forensic tools. Their task was clear: rebuild the case from the very beginning. At the center of this new unit stood Lieutenant Michael Turner, a man with 2 decades of experience. He was known for his persistence and his calm under fire. Alongside him was Laura Bennett, a younger investigator with sharp instincts who had already solved several smaller missing person cases. Together, they carried the hopes of a community desperate for justice. Their first move was to pull out the old boxes from 2007. Dusty containers sealed with yellow tape were carried into a sterile labroom. When Turner opened the first lid, the smell of old paper and stale air filled the space. He muttered quietly that 16 years of silence had sat in those boxes. Waiting for another chance to speak, laid out on a long table were the items from that first night: a crumpled beer can with faint lipstick smudges, a broken leather bracelet, photographed at the parking lot near the bar, soil samples, grainy photographs from the old CCTV camera. All of it seemed ordinary. Yet Turner and Bennett knew these objects held secrets that could not be uncovered with the technology of 2007. The beer can was sent first to the state lab. 16 years earlier, no usable results had been pulled from it, but now, new equipment could extract traces invisible to older systems. Forensic scientists worked with precision, lifting minuscule fragments of DNA from its surface. When the results came back, Turner and Bennett sat in silence as the lab director spoke. The DNA matched a profile in the state database. It belonged to Jake Howell, collected years later during a 2016 arrest for driving under the influence. The confirmation landed like a hammer. For years Jake had insisted he only helped Hannah, that he was nothing more than a friend. Now the beer can placed him at the very scene where she vanished. Bennett tapped her pen against the table, her voice steady but heavy. This ties him directly to that night. No excuses, no more doubts. But the story did not end there. The broken leather bracelet was next. Believed to have been torn from Hannah's wrist in a struggle, it had been bagged and stored since 2007. Under powerful microscopes, forensic experts carefully lifted skin cells trapped in the clasp. At first, the team expected only Hannah's DNA. Her blood and sweat were present, but then a second profile emerged. It was male, and it did not belong to Jake Howell. The room grew silent as the lab report was handed over. The unknown profile was not a match to any record in CODIS, the National DNA Database. It was a ghost, a man who had never been arrested, never had his DNA collected, yet he had touched Hannah's bracelet on the night she vanished. Bennett stared at the page for a long time. Her voice was low when she finally spoke. This means Hannah fought more than one person. The buyer can prove Jake was there. But this bracelet, this points to someone else entirely. Turner rubbed his temples, deep in thought. For 16 years, the investigation had circled Jake Howell, and now he was undeniably tied to the scene. But the bracelet's DNA opened a second door, an accomplice, another attacker, or perhaps a figure more dangerous than Jake himself. Findings leaked before officials could contain them. Newspapers printed the results in bold headlines. Jake Howell's DNA tied to beer can. Unknown male DNA discovered on victim's bracelet. Television anchors debated the meaning late into the night. Some declared it proved Jake was not alone. Others whispered of an even larger cover-up. For Susan Walker, the revelations were both vindication and torment. She had always believed Jake was involved, and now, the evidence proved it. But the idea of another man still out there haunted her. In a trembling interview, she said her daughter had not only faced one shadow, but had been surrounded by more than one. Her words echoed across Lexington, sending a chill into every home in the cold case unit office. Turner pinned the beer can photo to the investigation board with a red arrow pointing to Jake's portrait. Beside it, he placed a photograph of the bracelet with a second arrow labeled simply, Unknown Male DNA. The board was no longer centered on one suspect, it was split between two shadows. That night, Turner sat alone in the office, staring at Hannah's photo, her smile frozen in time. 16 years of silence were breaking open, but the truth was more tangled than anyone imagined. Jake Howell was no longer a man of suspicion. He was tied directly to Hannah's last night, but standing in the background was another man, faceless, nameless. Yet as real as the evidence on that bracelet, the investigation had gained new life. But it also grew darker, and the city of Lexington braced itself for answers that could change everything they thought they knew, and just as the pieces began to align, a new witness would step forward. carrying a memory that threatened to turn suspicion into undeniable reality. The discovery of the unknown, male DNA had shaken the case wide open, but investigators knew they could not lose sight of the man who had lingered in their files since the very beginning. Jake Howell had woven himself into the community as a loyal mourner, yet every new piece of evidence pulled him back into the shadows of suspicion. Lieutenant Michael Turner and investigator Laura Bennett began combing through old records, determined to uncover what had been overlooked in the dusty archives of Fayette County. Bennett found a file dated 2004. It described an incident at a high school where Jake had once worked as a maintenance worker. A young girl had reported that Jake cornered her in a storage room, touching her inappropriately and whispering crude remarks. The complaint never moved forward. The principal claimed there were no witnesses. The family chose not to press charges, and the case was quietly closed. Bennett set the thin file on the table, shaking her head. He was flagged years before Hannah ever went missing, she said, but no one listened. Turner frowned, realizing that indifference years earlier may have set the stage for tragedy in 2007. As they dug further, they spoke with neighbors from Jake's longtime Louisville home. Many painted a picture of a helpful man who carried groceries for the elderly, fixed broken wiring without asking for payment, and smiled warmly at block parties. To them, Jake was the kind of neighbor who made life easier. But when Bennett pressed gently, cracks appeared. One mother recalled a time she noticed Jake staring too long at her daughter in the backyard. She quickly called the child inside. Jake had laughed it off, saying he was just passing through. But the mother admitted she never forgot the way his eyes lingered. This dual portrait unsettled the investigators. Jake had built a mask of kindness, but beneath it ran a disturbing pattern of obsession and boundary crossing. Turner wrote in his notes that Jake's public image may have been the perfect camouflage, hiding darker truths in plain sight. Then came the breakthrough they had been waiting for. A man named Richard Callahan, now in his 40s, contacted the police after seeing news of the Corolla being pulled from the river. He said he had stayed silent for years, but the discovery had stirred his conscience. Sitting across from Turner and Bennett, his voice wavered as he spoke. On the night Hannah disappeared in 2007, he had been driving home from a night shift. On the shoulder of a dark road near the bar, he saw a silver-green Toyota Corolla. Behind it was a red pickup truck. Callahan said he knew that truck well because he had borrowed it once before from Jake Howell. He even remembered the faded decal on the back door. When Turner asked why he had not spoken sooner, Richard lowered his eyes. Jake lived nearby, he said, and knew his family. He was afraid of getting tangled in something dangerous. But after watching the news and seeing the car lifted from the water, his guilt consumed him. He had to speak. His testimony sent a jolt through the cold case unit. It was the missing link between Hannah's Corolla and Jake's pickup, confirming that both vehicles were on the road that night. It also aligned with the taxi driver's statement from 2007, who had reported a silver Corolla being closely followed by an old red truck. Now there was no mistaking it. That truck belonged to Jake. In the office, Turner pinned a photograph of a red pickup to the investigation board. He drew a thick red arrow from the truck straight to Jake Howell's portrait. The circle was tightening. Jake was no longer just the man suspected at the start. He was physically tied to the scene, the vehicles, and the victim. But the unknown male DNA still hovered on the board, glaring like a reminder that Hannah's nightmare may have involved more than one attacker. As the news of Richard Callahan's statement spread, the community gasped. Neighbors who had prayed with Jake felt a deep chill. A woman wept outside her church, saying she had trusted him like a brother. Others argued that if his truck was there, then he had lied for 16 years. Standing in plain sight while pretending to grieve, Susan Walker, when told of the new testimony, did not flinch. She had always believed Jake was guilty. Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. If people had listened to me from the beginning, she said, perhaps justice would not have taken 16 years to arrive. But she still asked the same question. If Jake was guilty, then whose DNA was on her daughter's bracelet? The walls were closing in on Jake Howell, but the shadow of a second man loomed larger than ever. And when investigators finally searched Jake's home, they would uncover objects that chilled even the most seasoned officers. The walls were already closing in on Jake Howell when investigators secured the final piece they needed. With Richard Callahan's testimony tying Jake's red pickup to Hannah's Corolla on the night of her disappearance, Turner and Bennett knew they had enough for a search warrant. On a grey April morning in 2023, a convoy of police vehicles rolled into Jake's quiet Louisville neighborhood. Neighbors peeked through curtains and stepped onto porches, whispering in disbelief as uniformed officers surrounded the house of the man they had once trusted. Jake stood outside, arms crossed, his face calm as though none of it surprised him. When officers moved in, he smirked faintly and muttered under his breath that it was just keepsakes, nothing more. His words were brushed aside as the forensic team began combing through the modest home. At first, nothing stood out. The living room was plain, decorated with cheap prints on the walls. The kitchen was spotless, the refrigerator nearly empty. But Turner knew better. The mask of normalcy often concealed the darkest secrets. It was in the garage that they found what they were searching for. The space was unusually tidy. Every tool hung in perfect rows. The concrete floor swept clean, almost unnaturally so. Against the far wall stood a tall wooden cabinet, secured with a rusted padlock. When ordered to open it, Jake simply shrugged. Officers cut the lock, and inside, they found a long box, also locked. Bennett pried it open with a crowbar, and what lay inside froze the room. The first item was a delicate silver necklace, its chain dulled with rust but still intact. Susan Walker was later shown the piece and broke down in tears. She had given that necklace to her daughter Hannah on her birthday in 2006. It was no coincidence. It was proof that Jake had kept something that belonged to Hannah. Something he had no reason to possess unless he had taken it from her. Beside the necklace was a faded concert ticket, dated October 2007. The very week Hannah disappeared. Underneath were yellowed newspaper clippings about her case, carefully folded and preserved. Each one carried headlines about her vanishing, her mother's pleas, and the growing despair in Lexington. It was more than memorabilia. It was obsession. Jake had not just lived with his guilt, he had nourished it, cataloging the tragedy he helped create. But the most chilling discovery came last. A small folded piece of paper slipped from the pile. Bennett unfolded it and read the words scrawled in thick black marker, "Keep quiet, or you are next." The room went silent. Turner stared at the note, his jaw tightening. This was no sentimental trophy. This was a threat. But who wrote it? And who was it meant for? Was it something Jake had written to intimidate someone else? Or was it sent to him, warning him to remain silent about another person involved? The evidence was carefully sealed and bagged. The necklace, the concert ticket, the clippings, and the note were taken to the lab for fingerprint and DNA analysis. The team left the garage shaken. The items were haunting on their own, but together they suggested more than just a killer's obsession. They hinted at a network of secrets. When Jake was confronted with the findings during questioning, he sat back in his chair, calm as ever. Turner laid the silver necklace on the table, his voice low, asking him why he had it. Jake smirked and said someone must have planted it. Bennett pressed further, showing him the threatening note. This time, Jake paused, his eyes narrowing. After a long silence, he leaned forward and said softly, "You do not get it. There are people more dangerous than me." His words left a chill in the room. They were not a denial. They were not an explanation. They were a warning. Turner and Bennett exchanged a look, knowing they were facing something larger than they had anticipated. If Jake was telling the truth, then Hannah's tragedy involved more than one man, and perhaps a web of silence that had stretched over 16 years. News of the search spread quickly. Headlines screamed about the necklace, the ticket, and the note. Local stations replayed footage of police removing bags of evidence from Jake's garage. The discovery ignited a storm of speculation. Some believed it proved Jake's guilt beyond doubt. Others latched onto the threatening note, convinced it meant another figure was hiding in the shadows. Someone who had forced Jake into silence all these years. Susan Walker was shown the note at the station. Her hands trembled so violently she had to sit down. Through her tears, she whispered that it meant Hannah had not simply vanished into one man's obsession, but had been trapped in something darker, perhaps hunted by more than one shadow. Turner pinned the note to the investigation board in his office, a red circle drawn around it with arrows pointing to both Jake Howell's photo and the unknown male DNA profile. It was a chilling reminder that the case was not only about Jake. It was about someone else who had left traces, yet still remained faceless. The garage had revealed trophies of obsession and a threat that refused to be ignored. And while Jake sat in custody, smirking as though he knew more than he would ever say, the investigation team realized the hardest question had just been forced upon them. Who was the other man hidden in the shadows of Hannah Walker's final night? After the haunting discoveries in Jake Howell's garage, Turner and Bennett knew they needed something irrefutable. Something that would remove any shred of doubt about Jake's direct involvement. The silver necklace, the threatening note, and the concert ticket were damning. But Jake's smirk and cryptic warning about more dangerous people kept the case shrouded in unease. The team decided to secure a fresh DNA sample from Jake in a way that left no room for dispute. In late April 2023, surveillance officers shadowed Jake as he moved through his routine. One morning, he walked into a Starbucks near his Louisville home. He ordered an iced coffee, sat quietly at a corner table, and scrolled on his phone. Every move was watched, every gesture noted. When he finished his drink, he tossed the plastic cup into the trash and walked out without looking back. That small act was all investigators needed. Within seconds, an undercover officer retrieved the cup, sealed it in an evidence bag, and delivered it straight to the state lab. For a week, the team waited in tense silence. Then the lab report arrived. Turner opened it slowly, reading each word with growing weight. The DNA recovered from the Starbucks cup matched perfectly with the DNA found on the beer can in the parking lot. From October 2007, it also matched the hair that had been discovered, tangled in Hannah's necklace, sealed away for 16 years in Jake's garage. The connection was undeniable. Jake Howell was not only at the scene the night Hannah disappeared, but he had kept her belongings as twisted trophies for over a decade. Bennett exhaled in relief as she read the report. Finally, the threads tied together into a single rope binding. Jake to the crime. She tapped the paper with her pen and said firmly that there was no escape left for him. Turner nodded, but his expression was not celebratory. He knew that while Jake was now cornered, the shadow of the second DNA still lingered, mocking them with silence. The broken leather bracelet recovered from the parking lot years ago carried another man's DNA. It had been tested again and again, run through every available database, but no match existed. Not in state records, not in federal records, not even in broader genealogy searches. Whoever this man was, he had never been arrested, never submitted his DNA, and had walked through life untouched by the systems that might have exposed him. This truth unsettled Turner deeply. He leaned back in his chair, staring at Hannah's photo pinned to the board, and muttered that the bracelet meant something more than just a stray touch. It was not a random contamination. That DNA was left. At the very moment Hannah fought back, it belonged to someone who had been there. Someone who had placed hands on her in her final moments. The frustration gnawed at the entire team. On one side, they had Jake caught red-handed, his DNA on the beer can, his DNA linked to Hannah's necklace, his trophies hidden away. On the other side, they had an invisible ghost, a faceless figure whose profile stared back at them from the lab's report with no name attached. The public was never told every detail, but whispers spread when news leaked that a second DNA profile existed. Social media filled with theories. Some claimed Jake had an accomplice who stayed silent all these years. Others believed the unknown man had been the real killer, while Jake only played a smaller role. And still others feared it meant a predator was still out there, living freely. in the community with no one the wiser. When Susan Walker was told about the latest results, her reaction was a mix of exhaustion and determination. She cried at the confirmation that Jake's DNA had been tied directly to Hannah's case. But when she heard that another man's DNA still had no match, she trembled. She said her daughter was not only betrayed by Jake, but faced by someone else in the darkness that night. She whispered that justice would never be complete until that second shadow was brought into the light. For Turner and Bennett, the case had reached a strange crossroads. They had everything they needed to move forward against Jake, but the mystery of the bracelet DNA threatened to overshadow the victory. It was the loose thread that refused to be tied, the shadow that still stood in the corner of the room. And as the team updated the board once more, 3 red arrows stretched across the photographs. One arrow from the beer can to Jake, another from the necklace to Jake, and a third, incomplete arrow from the bracelet to the faceless unknown. Turner stared at it in silence, then finally said that the case was not just about capturing Jake Howell. It was about finding the ghost who still walked free. Even as Jake sat smugly in custody, his fate tightening around him, the unanswered question loomed heavier than ever. Who was the man behind the DNA that still had no name? After the confirmation of Jake Howell's DNA, Turner and Bennett knew the case could no longer rely on fragments of suspicion. They needed to stitch the night of October 12, 2007, into a full picture. Moment by moment, from the neon glow of the Lexington bar to the final resting place of the Corolla at the bottom of the Kentucky River. Only by retracing those steps could they understand what truly happened to Hannah Walker. In the cold case office, a massive board was set up. Photographs, maps, and handwritten notes were pinned in sequence. Turner started at the bar's entrance, pointing to the blurry CCTV still of Hannah and Jake in the parking lot. At 11:40 p.m., she stepped into the damp night air, her arms folded, her expression tense. By 11:48 p.m., she sent the last message her phone would ever deliver. Jake is taking me home. From that moment, the silence began. Next on the board was a map tracing the road out of town. A witness, Richard Callahan, had confirmed he saw Hannah's Corolla heading toward the river, with Jake's red pickup close behind. The old taxi driver's account from 2007 now aligned perfectly. The evidence suggested a convoy, one car pressed forward, another pressing close behind. Turner paused as he looked at the arrows. Hannah was boxed in, unable to escape once that road stretched into the quiet dark dot at the parking lot scene. Bennett placed the broken leather bracelet. Forensics had proven it carried Hannah's DNA, along with an unknown male's DNA, not Jake's. She explained that this was no random transfer. It showed a physical struggle, Hannah pulling away from someone else before she was forced into the car. Turner added the beer can, marked with Jake's DNA, tying him directly to that same spot. The board moved forward to the river's edge. Photographs of the recovered Corolla sat in the center. Divers had reported the windshield shattered outward, fragments jutting into the water. This meant Hannah, still alive when the car began sinking, had tried to break free. The thought made Susan Walker tremble when it was explained to her. Her daughter had not simply disappeared into the night. She had fought until the very last moment for her life. But the most unsettling discovery came from the car's rear passenger mat. A faint shoe print had been lifted, carefully preserved despite the years underwater. Its size was noted as 11, significantly larger than Jake Howell's shoe size of 9.5. Turner circled it in red on the board. This was not Jake's footprint. Someone else had been in that car with Hannah. The realization hit like a wave through the cold case unit. Bennett whispered what had been on everyone's mind. Hannah was not attacked by one man. There were two. One driving, one in the back seat, forcing her down as she tried to fight back. Turner tapped the bracelet photograph, the unknown male DNA, and then the shoe print. He said in a low voice that this shadowy figure was no longer just a theory. He was present that night. He sat in the car. He left a trace. The silence in the office was thick. The possibility of an accomplice had always lingered, but the size 11 shoeprint brought it into sharp focus. Whoever this second man was, he had remained invisible for 16 years. His DNA unclaimed, his identity unknown. When news of the shoeprint leaked, the public's fear deepened. Local broadcasts flashed the headline in bold red letters: at least 2 men were in the car. Families gathered in living rooms, whispering about neighbors, co-workers, and strangers on the street. Was the second man still living among them? Was he watching the coverage, confident he had escaped the net? Susan Walker sat through another briefing at the station, her hands gripping the armrest of her chair. She listened as Turner explained the footprint, the DNA, and the convoy of vehicles. She closed her eyes, fighting tears, and whispered that her daughter had not faced one devil that night, but 2. The weight of that reality pressed heavily on her frail shoulders. The reconstruction of the timeline shifted the entire case. It no longer fit the narrative of a single predator acting alone. Instead, it painted a darker picture, one where Hannah was trapped by 2 men. Her car driven to the river with no chance of escape. Turner stood before the board one last time. That evening, his marker pointing at the trail of evidence, he muttered that Jake Howell may be the man in custody. But the larger shoeprint and the unknown DNA proved that the story was not finished. There was another man in the dark, and until he was named, justice was only half won. And so the question loomed heavier than ever. Who was the faceless figure who left behind a footprint and vanished into the shadows 16 years ago? By early summer of 2023, the timeline reconstruction, the shoeprint, and the DNA results had closed the circle around Jake Howell. The investigators knew it was time to move. With national attention pressing down and the public demanding answers, Fayette County requested the assistance of the FBI to ensure Jake's arrest was carried out with precision. At dawn, black SUV rolled quietly into Jake's Louisville neighborhood. Agents in tactical gear surrounded his modest home, weapons drawn but kept low. A loudspeaker broke the stillness of the morning, ordering Jake to come out with his hands raised. For a moment, the blinds twitched, and then the door creaked open. Jake stepped onto the porch wearing a wrinkled shirt, his hair disheveled, yet his expression calm. His hands rose slowly, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along, as the cuffs snapped around his wrists. Jake turned his head slightly toward one of the agents and whispered words that chilled everyone who later heard them. "You only know half the story." The statement rippled through the cold case unit as he was transported to the Fayette County Jail. Turner and Bennett prepared the interrogation room, laying out photographs of the recovered Corolla, the silver necklace, the threatening note, and the lab results. They knew this was not just about pressing him for answers, it was about unraveling the taunt he had thrown into the air. Jake was led in, shackled at the wrists, and seated across the table. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. Turner began with the simplest question. Why was your DNA on the beer can in the parking lot where Hannah was last seen? Jake leaned back, a faint smirk curling his lips. He said that everyone had drinks that night. Maybe he had left it there. His tone was calm, dismissive, as if none of it mattered. Bennett slid a photograph of the silver necklace across the table. The chain dull but unmistakable. "This," she said, "was given to Hannah by her mother. It was found in your garage. Explain." "That?" Jake stared at it for a long time, then shrugged. "People keep things," he said quietly. "Maybe someone left it for me." His answers were never outright denials, only slippery words meant to cloud the truth. Turner leaned in closer, his voice heavy. "What about the note? Keep quiet, or you are next. Was that written by you, or was it written to you?" Jake's eyes flickered for the first time. His smirk faded just slightly. He looked down at his hands, then back up, with a measured calm. "There are people you do not want to know," he said softly. "More dangerous than me." The words hung in the air, like a poisonous fog. Turner pressed harder. "Who was in the car with you that night? Who left the shoeprint? Who touched the bracelet?" Jake tilted his head, his gaze distant, almost taunting. He did not give a name. He only repeated the same phrase again, slower this time. You only know half the story. The silence that followed was unbearable. Bennett's hand tightened on her pen, her frustration barely contained. Jake seemed to enjoy their unease, as though he found strength in their lack of answers about the second man. His presence in the room was not of a man broken by evidence, but of a man who believed he still held a secret no one else could touch. Outside the room, Susan Walker was waiting. She had not been told about his cryptic warnings yet, but she could feel the weight of something unspoken in the eyes of the investigators. To her, Jake was the face of the evil that had stolen her daughter, but to Turner and Bennett, he was becoming something more, a doorway to another figure they had not yet identified. The arrest of Jake Howell brought relief to the city of Lexington. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, some cheering, others shaking their heads in disbelief that the man who had lit candles at vigils was the same man now accused of murder. But inside the cold case unit, the atmosphere was anything but celebratory. Jake had confirmed what they feared. The story was not complete. Someone else had been there. Someone who had left traces, but no name. Turner stood at the board that night, staring at the arrows connecting the beer can, the necklace, and the shoe print. He muttered that Jake's smirk was not the smile of a man caught, but of a man who still believed he had power. And until the faceless accomplice was uncovered, that power would remain. The arrest was a victory, but it was also a reminder. The shadow of Hannah's final night still stretched beyond Jake Howell. And somewhere in the darkness, another man was waiting. The Sunday following Jake Howell's arrest, the church in Lexington overflowed. Candles flickered along the pews, but this time, the air was not filled with quiet prayers alone. It was thick with anger. Neighbors who had once embraced Jake at vigils now sat in stunned silence, their faces twisted with betrayal. Mothers whispered that he had stood beside them as they prayed for Hannah. Fathers clenched their fists, remembering how he had promised to help search. The betrayal cut deeper than the crime itself. At the front of the sanctuary, Susan Walker sat with Hannah's photograph resting on her lap. Her face was pale, her hands trembling, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady. She said she had always known Jake was hiding the truth, and now the world finally saw it. But her words did not end in relief. She said she believed more than one man was guilty, that Hannah had been trapped by more than one shadow. The congregation fell silent, the weight of her certainty pressing into every corner of the room. After the service, the crowd spilled onto the church lawn. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones pointed at grieving faces. Some demanded Jake's immediate conviction. Others shouted about the unknown accomplice. The unity that once held the community together began to splinter. People who had defended Jake for years now hung their heads in shame. Some neighbors admitted they had ignored their own doubts, too blinded by his charm to see the truth. In the midst of this rupture, a new voice stepped forward. His name was Thomas Reynolds, a former neighbor of Jake's from 2010. He had kept quiet for years, but the arrest shook him. He said that late one evening, more than a decade earlier, he had been returning home when he saw something strange. A tall, thin man entered Jake's garage. He was not Jake. His walk was different, his build slimmer, his movements deliberate. Thomas remembered it clearly because Jake always kept his garage locked tight, yet that night, another man had slipped inside with ease, as if he belonged there. When asked why he had not reported it sooner, Thomas admitted he was afraid. He had sensed something dangerous in the way the man moved, something secretive. But now, with Hannah's case reopened and Jake behind bars, he felt compelled to speak. Turner and Bennett listened intently as Thomas described the figure. Tall, thin, dark hair. He could not recall the man's face clearly, but he swore it was not Jake. He also said that after that night, he often wondered if Jake had not been acting alone, but had been working with someone else who remained hidden in the shadows. The detail struck Bennett sharply. If another man had free access to Jake's garage, then perhaps the trophies found inside were not kept by Jake alone. Perhaps the threatening note was written by someone else, a warning to Jake as much as to anyone else. The statement was recorded and added to the growing board of evidence. Turner drew another arrow from the unknown DNA and the size 11 shoe print to a new box labeled simply tall, thin male. The accomplice theory was no longer speculation. It had a witness. For Susan, hearing Thomas's words was both confirmation and torment. She was right to believe there was more than one man, but it deepened the horror of imagining what Hannah had faced. She clutched her daughter's photograph tighter, whispering that her fight would not end until both shadows were unmasked. The church vigil that had once been a place of comfort now stood as a turning point. Trust was shattered. Faith in appearances was broken. And from that night on, Lexington no longer believed that Jake Howell alone carried the truth. Another figure was out there, watching from the dark. Perhaps even closer than anyone dared to imagine. And as the investigation pushed forward, the courtroom itself would soon become the stage where these shadows collided. By the fall of 2023, the courthouse in Lexington became the center of national attention. Crowds gathered outside every morning, clutching signs with Hannah Walker's name, while reporters shouted into cameras about the case that had gripped the nation for 16 years. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. The trial of Jake Howell was about to begin. The prosecution opened with a calm but relentless narrative. They laid out Hannah's last night in sequence, step by step, from the moment she left the bar to the discovery of her Corolla in the Kentucky River. They showed the jury the beer can collected in the parking lot, now proven to carry Jake's DNA. They displayed photographs of the silver necklace Susan had given her daughter, recovered from Jake's locked garage. They introduced the Starbucks cup retrieved only months earlier, its DNA match confirming beyond doubt that Jake's profile tied directly to the beer can and to hair found tangled in the necklace. Piece by piece, the prosecutor built a chain. The broken bracelet with signs of struggle, the convoy of vehicles reported by witnesses, with Jake's red pickup trailing Hannah's Corolla, the shoe print in the back of the car, suggesting Hannah was not alone in her final moments. And finally, the car itself, pulled from the river 16 years later with Hannah's belongings still inside. The jury was told that this was no accident, no misfortune. This was the careful, deliberate act of a man who wanted Hannah silenced forever. Susan Walker sat in the front row, her hands clasped, tears rolling silently down her cheeks, as the photographs of her daughter's student ID soaked in river water were shown on the screen. To her, each item was not just evidence, but a fragment of Hannah's stolen life. When the defense rose, the tone shifted sharply. Jake's lawyer leaned heavily on the gaps that still remained. He told the jury that while Jake's DNA was present on the beer can, there was no proof that it placed him at the exact moment Hannah vanished. He argued that the necklace could have been planted in Jake's garage, that his client had been framed by someone who wanted to shift blame. But his most powerful tool was the unknown DNA on the bracelet. He repeated it again and again. The bracelet carried the profile of another man. That DNA did not belong to Jake. The size 11 shoe print in the car did not belong to Jake. The defense hammered the idea that another man had been responsible, and Jake was only caught in the storm. Then the defense added a new twist. They hinted at a rumor that had circulated in whispers for years. They suggested that a powerful businessman in Lexington, with ties to local politics and a hidden history of exploiting young women, might have been the second man. They did not name him directly, but the implication was clear enough that the courtroom buzzed with unease. The defense insisted that investigators had turned a blind eye to this possibility. Two focused on Jake, while ignoring men of influence who could easily have manipulated events. The prosecution objected fiercely, calling it speculation with no evidence. The judge allowed the defense to proceed, but reminded the jury to focus only on the facts. Still, the suggestion lingered in the room like smoke. Impossible to fully clear. Turner and Bennett sat at the prosecution table, their faces tense. They knew the evidence against Jake was strong, but they also knew the gaps gave the defense dangerous leverage. The unknown male DNA and the larger shoe print were undeniable cracks in the case, cracks that could give the jury pause. As witnesses testified, the tension deepened. The taxi driver repeated his account of seeing the two cars leaving the bar. Richard Callahan spoke of the red pickup trailing Hannah's Corolla, his voice unsteady but firm. Forensic experts explained. The DNA matches, the shattered windshield, the hair in the plastic bag. Piece by piece, the case painted Jake as guilty. Yet each time the bracelet or the shoe print was mentioned, the defense seized the opportunity. They reminded the jury that another man had left those marks, and that the prosecution could not name him. They urged the jury to ask themselves whether they could convict beyond reasonable doubt when the shadow of another suspect loomed so clearly in the evidence. The courtroom became a battlefield of certainty against doubt. On one side, the chain of physical evidence tied Jake to Hannah's final night. On the other, the haunting absence of a name for the second man opened a door to speculation. Outside, the community fractured once again. Some shouted for Jake's immediate conviction, pointing to the necklace and the DNA. Others whispered about the businessman rumor, believing a larger cover-up was at play. Lexington, once united in grief, now split under the weight of suspicion. Susan Walker returned home each evening from the courthouse, exhausted, clutching Hannah's photograph as though her daughter's spirit was watching over the proceedings. She prayed that the jury would see through the defense's smoke, but she also feared the unknown man would forever keep the truth incomplete. The first phase of the trial left Lexington restless. The evidence was damning, but the unanswered gaps were deep. And as the trial moved forward, the past would resurface with chilling echoes, connecting Hannah's case to other disappearances that had long been buried in silence. As Jake Howell's trial entered its second month, the courtroom was no longer the only stage where the story unfolded. Outside those walls, a new wave of media coverage widened the storm. Reporters dug deeper, hunting for patterns that might stretch beyond Hannah Walker's disappearance. And soon, their efforts unearthed cases that had long gathered dust, cases that now carried eerie echoes of Hannah's tragedy. The first was the disappearance of Melissa Gray in 2005. She was 22 years old, last seen leaving a riverside diner late at night. Her car was found abandoned near a bridge, the keys still in the ignition, but she was never located. The case was never solved, and over time it faded from headlines. But when Hannah's Corolla was pulled from the Kentucky River, journalists began to draw comparisons. Melissa, too, had vanished near the river. Melissa, too, had been young, vibrant, and full of promise. The second case surfaced from 2009. A man named Harold Whitman disappeared after leaving a fishing trip with friends. His truck was discovered parked near the same stretch of water where Hannah's car had been hidden. Like Melissa, he was never seen again. The files described him as an avid outdoorsman with no history of running away. His disappearance baffled investigators. And without leads, it was quietly marked inactive. Now, both cases returned to the spotlight. Television hosts lined up photographs of Melissa, Harold, and Hannah side by side. Commentators whispered of a possible serial pattern. 3 disappearances near the river, 3 cases with no closure. And in the middle of it all, the newly uncovered unknown male DNA from Hannah's bracelet hovered like a ghost, begging the question of whether the same man was tied to all of them. The speculation took on a life of its own. National outlets framed the story as the emergence of a hidden predator who had stalked central Kentucky for decades. True crime programs pieced together timelines, suggesting that Hannah's case might not stand alone, but instead fit into a chilling chain of events. For Turner and Bennett, the media frenzy complicated everything. On one hand, it fueled public pressure, forcing resources to flow into the investigation. On the other, it risked clouding the facts with speculation. Still, they could not ignore the parallels. They revisited the Gray and Whitman files, searching for overlooked traces, hoping the unknown DNA might finally find its match. But the results were always the same. The bracelet DNA was run against every scrap of evidence from both cases. No match. The haunting profile remained isolated, mocking the investigators who were desperate to tie it to a name. Susan Walker, already shattered by years of unanswered questions, watched the coverage with trembling hands. when she saw Melissa Gray's face on the screen beside Hannah's. She whispered that both girls had been hunted by the same shadow. She believed her daughter had not been alone in her fate. That Hannah's case was part of something larger and darker than anyone dared to admit. The courtroom buzzed louder than ever. The defense seized on the media's narrative, arguing that the unknown DNA proved Hannah's death was part of a broader pattern, one Jake had been wrongly swept into. The prosecution countered that the necklace, the beer can, and the garage trophies tied Hannah's case uniquely to Jake. Yet even they could not dismiss the possibility that someone else had been circling the river, watching, waiting, and striking. Lexington, once fractured by rumor, now trembled under the weight of dread. People asked if the second man was still out there, free, blending into the community. They wondered if Melissa Gray and Harold Whitman had fallen into the same trap as Hannah. And they asked the question that had haunted Susan for 16 years. Who was the man behind the unknown DNA? The trial had begun as a case against Jake Howell, but the storm outside the courthouse had shifted the story. It was no longer only about Hannah Walker. It was about shadows stretching across years, across victims, and across lives that ended too soon. And as speculation swelled, Turner and Bennett faced a terrifying possibility. If Hannah's disappearance was part of a larger chain, then uncovering the truth about the unknown man was not just about justice for her, it was about stopping someone who may have walked the river's edge again and again, leaving only silence in his wake. By the final week of the trial, the courthouse in Lexington had become a fortress of tension. Each day, the benches were filled to capacity, reporters jostled for space, and Susan Walker sat in the front row with Hannah's photograph clutched in her hands. The weight of 16 years pressed down on every word spoken. For the prosecution, this was their last chance to bind the chain of evidence so tightly that no juror could look away. For the defense, it was their last chance to fan the embers of doubt, reminding the jury that one shadow still remained unnamed. The closing arguments began with the prosecution. The lead prosecutor stood firm, her voice steady as she pieced the story together. She pointed to the beer can from the parking lot, now proven to carry Jake Howell's DNA. She reminded the jury of the silver necklace Susan had given Hannah, found locked away in Jake's garage. She showed them the Starbucks cup that matched the beer can and the hair from the necklace, confirming Jake's presence in every link of the chain. She spoke of the convoy of vehicles seen that night. Hannah's Corolla followed closely by Jake's red pickup. She described the shattered windshield, the broken bracelet, the lone sneaker, and the book bag recovered from the car pulled from the Kentucky River. Each piece of evidence, she argued, was not a coincidence. Each piece was a brick, and together, they built a wall of truth that could not be denied. The prosecutor paused, her gaze settling on the jury. Beyond reasonable doubt does not mean beyond all doubt, she said. It means you can see the pattern clearly, that the story aligns beyond chance, and in this case, the story is clear. Jake Howell lured Hannah Walker out of that bar, trapped her in her car, and drove her to her death. She ended with a quiet, resolute voice. 16 years of silence end here. The defense rose, shifting the air sharply. Jake's attorney paced, slowly, in front of the jury, his voice low but insistent. He reminded them of the unknown male DNA on Hannah's bracelet. He held up the chart, showing the size 11 shoe print, larger than Jake's, found in the back of the car. He repeated the phrase again and again. This is not Jake Howell's DNA. These are not Jake Howell's shoes. Then he leaned in closer to the jury box, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. If there is another man involved, if there is another shadow the prosecution cannot name, then how can you say beyond reasonable doubt that Jake acted alone, or even that Jake was the one who struck the fatal blow? He invoked the rumors of powerful men in Lexington, hinting that Jake had been made into the scapegoat, while the real predator remained untouched. The defense sat down, leaving the courtroom in uneasy silence. The jury filed out to deliberate, their faces tense, their thoughts unreadable. Susan lowered her head, whispering a prayer that her daughter's voice would finally be heard. Hours passed before the jury returned. The room rose as the foreman handed the verdict slip to the judge. Everyone held their breath as the words were read aloud. On the charge of murder, guilty. On the charge of kidnapping, guilty. On the charge of evidence tampering, guilty. Jake Howell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted, some sobbing, some cheering, some simply stunned into silence. Susan collapsed into tears, clutching Hannah's photograph to her chest. 16 years of waiting had ended in justice, at least in part. As Jake was led from the courtroom in chains, he turned his head slightly toward the gallery. His voice was calm, almost casual, but it cut through the noise like a blade. "The other guy is still out there." The words froze the room. Reporters scrambled to capture them, scribbling in their notebooks. Susan felt her stomach twist, knowing he was not bluffing. Turner and Bennett exchanged a glance, both unsettled by the certainty in Jake's tone. The gavel fell, and the trial was over. Jake Howell would never walk free again. But his final words left a shadow longer than the sentence. For while the courtroom had delivered justice to one man, it had also confirmed the fear that haunted every corner of Lexington. Somewhere beyond those walls, another man still walked free. The ghost behind the unknown DNA and the size 11 shoe printer case had reached its verdict, but the story was far from finished. The trial was over. Jake Howell was locked away for life, his mask finally torn from his face. But for Lexington, and for Susan Walker, the ending was not as clean as the courtroom verdict. The truth had been spoken, yet shadows remained. Each October, on the anniversary of Hannah's disappearance, Susan returned to the church with her daughter's photograph in hand. The crowd had grown smaller over the years, but the candles still flickered in the dark sanctuary. Susan's voice had grown weaker, her frame more fragile, but her resolve never faded. She whispered Hannah's name with the same pain and the same love she carried since that night in 2007. She reminded the few who gathered that while justice had come for one man, another figure had never been named. The unknown DNA on the bracelet and the size 11 shoe print still lingered as haunting proof. For the people of Lexington, the river itself became a scar. Parents warned their children not to walk near its banks after dark. Fishermen who once cast lines with ease now glanced over their shoulders, uneasy about what the waters might still conceal. Even those who had never known Hannah spoke of the Kentucky River with a shiver, as though its currents carried secrets that could never truly rest. Yet through the grief, there was also a lesson. The discovery of Hannah's car, after 16 years, showed the power of persistence, of technology, and of ordinary people refusing to let silence win. Civilian dive teams with advanced sonar had accomplished what official searchers had failed to do for over a decade. Journalists, volunteers, and Hannah's own mother had kept her story alive when others had moved on. It was a reminder that truth is not found in the first search or the second, but in never letting the questions fade away. Turner and Bennett moved on to other cases, but Hannah's story became a marker in their careers. They often spoke about it when teaching younger investigators. They explained how evidence once dismissed as weak had become powerful years later. They spoke of the importance of rechecking old files with fresh eyes. They said Hannah's case was proof that time can bury secrets, but it can also expose them if persistence is strong enough. For Susan, life never returned to what it had been. She carried Hannah's photograph everywhere she went, tucked into her purse, placed by her bedside. The necklace once stolen from her daughter was returned to her, and she kept it inside a small wooden box, too painful to wear, too sacred to leave behind. She would sometimes open the lid, hold it in her palm, and whisper that she had never stopped fighting. The city itself carried the story like a wound. Some said it made them more cautious, more alert. Others admitted it made them more fearful, less trusting of neighbors who smiled too easily. But everyone agreed that Hannah's disappearance, and the long years before justice, left a permanent mark on the community. And so, Hannah's case became more than a story of crime. It became a call for vigilance, a call for transparency in investigations, A call to use technology not only when cases are new, but when they are old and fading. And most of all, it became a call to never surrender hope, even when years pass and answers seem buried. As for Jake Howell, he will spend the rest of his life behind prison walls. His final words still echo. The other guy is still out there. Maybe he was only trying to taunt. Maybe he was telling the truth. The unknown DNA and the shoe print suggest that Hannah's story may never be completely closed. That second shadow may still walk free, unseen, unrecognized. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all. Tonight, as you listen to this story, imagine Susan standing alone at the church. The candles flickering, her voice breaking as she whispers her daughter's name. Imagine the river flowing silently, in the dark, carrying secrets no current can wash away. And ask yourself how many shadows still walk beside us, hidden in plain sight. If you are still here with me, still watching and listening, then this story deserves your like and your subscribe. Please help me reach the target of 5,000 likes, a promise I made to my mother. It costs you nothing, but it means everything. And tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this cold case story. This has been Unscripted Tales. Thank you for keeping Hannah Walker's memory alive.